15 ancient civilizations more terrifying than your nightmares. Let's get to it. Number 15. The Zapotec civilization. Imagine a ritual. The air is thick with the smoke of burning copal, and the rhythmic chant of priests echoes off stone walls. A figure emerges, adorned in brilliant red feathers and shimmering gold. But as it moves into the firelight, you notice something is wrong. The skin seems ill-fitting, loose. There's a second layer underneath, and the face is a grotesque mask. This isn't just a costume. It is a man wearing the freshly flayed skin of another human being. Welcome to the world of the Zapotec and their god of renewal, Teotihuacan, our lord, the flayed one. This Mesoamerican deity, also worshipped by the Toltecs and Aztecs who came later, was a god of agriculture, spring, and rebirth. To honor him and to ensure a bountiful harvest, a truly horrific ceremony was required. During the festival of Tlacaxipewalisli, or the flaying of men, priests would sacrifice war captives, often through heart extraction. Then they would carefully flay the victim, removing the skin in one large piece. This skin, dyed yellow and called the golden clothes, was then worn by another priest for 20 days. The act was meant to symbolize a seed shedding its outer husk before germination, or a snake shedding its skin. It was a gruesome prayer for new life, written in blood and flesh. The rational explanation is that this was a deeply symbolic religious act. Teotihuacan himself was said to have flayed his own skin to feed humanity. So this was an act of imitation, not malice, a way of participating in the brutal cycle of death and rebirth that governs all life. But knowing the logic behind it doesn't make it any less terrifying. It simply raises a more profound question. What does it say about a civilization when their holiest act of creation requires you to become a monster? Number 14. The Toltec Empire. You are walking through the capital of a powerful empire. The art here is unsettling. Stone carvings depict colossal serpents not just slithering, but actively devouring human hearts. Statues of reclining warriors hold bowls on their stomachs, waiting for an offering you'd rather not think about. And then you see the wall. It's not made of stone, but of skulls. Hundreds upon hundreds of human skulls carved with terrifying precision, staring out with empty eyes in a permanent, silent scream. The Toltecs were the precursors to the Aztecs, and they laid the groundwork for much of their infamous brutality. Their capital at Tula is a gallery of horrors. Their art is dominated by images of predators like jaguars, coyotes, and eagles, devouring human hearts, a clear statement of their martial ideology. But their most fearsome architectural innovation was the Tzompantli. This was a massive skull rack used to display the heads of sacrificial victims. While the Aztecs would perfect the use of real skulls, the Toltecs built monumental stone walls carved with row after row of skulls, a permanent testament to their sacrificial cult. These structures, along with the reclining Chacmol statues designed to hold the hearts of the sacrificed, broadcast a clear message. This was an empire built on death, fed by blood, and it had an insatiable appetite. From a political perspective, the Tzompantli was a brilliant tool of psychological warfare. It was a billboard advertising the power of the state and the futility of resistance. It was state-sponsored terror designed to keep subjects and enemies in a constant state of fear. But it also reveals a chilling truth about power. We tell ourselves that civilization is a process of taming our worst instincts. But what if the opposite is true? What if civilization is simply the process of organizing our horrors on a grander, more terrifying scale? Number 13.
the Kalinga Kingdom. He was a conqueror, the grandson of a legendary empire builder. He commanded a vast army and had a reputation for ruthlessness. His next target was a prosperous kingdom, and he marched upon it with overwhelming force. The battle was a foregone conclusion, a brutal but simple affair of statecraft. But when the dust settled and the emperor walked the battlefield, something inside him broke. The sheer scale of the carnage that he had unleashed was so absolute, it didn't just win him a kingdom, it shattered his mind. This was the Kalinga War, fought around 261 BCE between the Mauryan Empire under Emperor Ashoka and the independent kingdom of Kalinga. Kalinga was a prosperous state with powerful trade routes, and Ashoka sought to bring it under his control. The battle was one of the largest and deadliest in Indian history. Ashoka's own rock edicts, the historical record of his reign, state that 100,000 Kalingans were killed in the fighting. 150,000 were deported, and many more perished from disease and starvation in the aftermath. Confronted by this apocalyptic landscape of death, the sheer, unimaginable suffering that he had caused, Ashoka had a complete psychological and spiritual breakdown. The man who had been a ruthless conqueror was gone, replaced by something entirely new. Overwhelmed by remorse, Ashoka renounced all violence and converted to Buddhism, dedicating the rest of his reign to a policy of Dhamma, or moral law. He became one of history's greatest patrons of peace. It's a powerful story of redemption, proof that even the hardest heart can be changed. But it leaves us with a haunting question. We celebrate Ashoka's transformation, but at what cost did it come? How much blood has to be spilled before a monster finally looks in the mirror?
Number 12. The Teotihuacan civilization. Imagine a city without a king. Not a democracy, but a metropolis of giants, home to 100,000 people, dominated by pyramids the size of mountains. For centuries, archaeologists believe this city, Teotihuacan, was a peaceful center of commerce and religion. They found no evidence of a royal dynasty, no portraits of warrior kings. It seemed to be an exception in the brutal history of Mesoamerica. And then they started digging inside the pyramids. Deep within the foundations of Teotihuacan's monumental structures, like the Pyramid of the Moon and the Feathered Serpent Pyramid, a much darker story emerged. These were not just temples, they were tombs built on blood. Excavations have revealed evidence of massive, ritualized human sacrifices performed to dedicate the buildings. One burial vault in the Moon Pyramid contained 12 bodies, 10 of which were decapitated. Many victims were found with their hands bound behind their backs. Another burial associated with the Feathered Serpent Pyramid contained the remains of around 200 individuals, many of whom were identified as foreign warriors, likely captured in battle. They weren't just killed, they were systematically arranged, some adorned with necklaces of human jaws, turning their very bones into a statement of the city's power. The logical explanation is that these were dedication rituals, a way of feeding the gods and sanctifying these immense structures to ensure the city's prosperity. It was a public spectacle, a brutal performance of state power at the heart of their ceremonial landscape. But it shatters the image of a peaceful city. Teotihuacan didn't lack kings because it was enlightened. It hid them. Its power was so absolute, so baked into the very stones of the city, that it didn't need a face. What's more terrifying, a tyrant on a throne or a tyranny with no one in charge? Number 11. The Nazca culture. You're a warrior, captured in battle on the arid plains of ancient Peru. You know your end is near, but it won't be quick. Your captors are meticulous.
After they kill you, they will carefully slice the head from your body. With a sharp obsidian knife, they will drill a hole in your forehead, remove your brain and soft tissue through the base of your skull, and then pin your lips shut with the spine of a cactus. You are not just being killed, you are being remade. The Nazca people are famous for drawing gigantic lines in the desert, but they had a far more personal and gruesome art form, the creation of trophy heads. These were not simply the severed heads of enemies, they were ritual objects that had been deliberately modified. After severing the head, a hole was drilled in the forehead to attach a rope for carrying or display. The base of the skull was often broken away to remove the brain, and the resulting cavity was stuffed with cloth or vegetable matter. The lips were then pinned shut. While the name trophy head suggests they were spoils of war, their primary purpose seems to have been ritualistic. They appear frequently in Nazca art, often associated with agriculture and fertility, and have been buried in caches, suggesting they were powerful religious offerings. Anthropologists believe that for the Nazca, the head was the vessel of life force and power. By taking and transforming a head, they weren't just killing an enemy. They were harnessing their spirit for the good of the community, turning a vessel of life into a tool for ensuring their own survival. This adds a layer of spiritual significance to the horror, but it begs a chilling question. If your culture believes that the only way to ensure a good harvest is to desecrate the dead, how long before you start seeing every living person as a potential ghost? Number 10. The Mongol Empire. The terms of surrender are simple, delivered by an envoy from the approaching army. You have 1 day. A white tent is pitched outside your city walls. If you surrender while the white tent flies, your people will be spared and folded into the new empire. But if you resist, tomorrow, a red tent will be raised. If the red tent flies, every man in the city will be put to the sword. If you still resist, a third tent will appear, a black tent, and that means everyone and everything dies. Under Genghis Khan, the Mongols perfected a brutal but chillingly effective form of psychological warfare. Their policy was simple: surrender or die. Before attacking a city, they would offer terms. Those who submitted immediately were generally spared, their artisans and engineers assimilated, their rulers left in place as vassals, and their people required to pay tribute. However, for any city that refused this single chance, the consequences were apocalyptic. The Mongols would employ a strategy of total war, ordering the collective slaughter of the entire population. When they took cities like Samarkand, Urgench, or Merv, they didn't just conquer them, they erased them, systematically executing men, women, and children until no one was left breathing. This wasn't random violence, it was policy, a well-tested tactic to ensure the next city would not dare resist. From a strategic standpoint, this policy was ruthlessly logical. With a relatively small army conquering a vast territory, the Mongols couldn't afford long, costly sieges. Terror was their most efficient weapon. The mountains of skulls left at one city were an advertisement for surrender to the next. It was a calculated strategy of conquest by capitulation. But this cold logic only makes the horror more profound. It reveals that the greatest atrocities in history are often not the product of madness, but of reason.
Number 9. The Huns under Attila. To the terrified citizens of the crumbling Roman Empire, they seemed to come from nowhere. Nomadic horsemen from the vast unknown steppes of the East. They lived on their horses, fought on their horses, and brought a storm of violence that seemed less like war and more like a force of nature. Their leader was not seen as a king or a general, but as a divine punishment, a title he wore with pride, Flagellum Dei, the scourge of God. Attila the Hun didn't just lead an army, he led a migratory wave of destruction. For 2 decades in the 5th century AD, he carved a path of terror across Europe, from the Black Sea to France. The Huns were masters of the lightning raid, sacking and pillaging cities with a ferocity that left even the battle-hardened Romans in shock. They extorted massive tributes of gold from the Eastern Roman Empire simply to not attack. Roman chroniclers described them as barbarians who left nothing but devastation in their wake, giving rise to the saying, "Where Attila has passed, no grass grows." Their conquests were so brutal and seemingly indiscriminate that for the Christian Romans there was only one possible explanation. This was a punishment sent from heaven. Historians argue that Attila was actually a shrewd politician, not a mindless destroyer. His campaigns were not random, they were calculated acts of political and economic extortion. He used terror as a tool to build an empire that for a brief time stretched across Central Europe. His ultimate goal wasn't just to burn the world, but to rule it. Yet this rational explanation feels insufficient. It doesn't capture the sheer elemental terror he inspired, a fear so profound that it outlived his short-lived empire and made his name synonymous with destruction itself. Number 8. The Shang dynasty. The king is dead. For the hundreds of servants, concubines, soldiers, and artisans who served him in his palace, this is not just a time of mourning. It is the end. As the monarch's body is lowered into his massive tomb, surrounded by precious bronze vessels and jade ornaments, they are led down the ramps into the darkness. They are not there to pay their respects. They are there to join him, and they will not be returning to the world of the living. In ancient China, during the Shang dynasty, the death of a king was a mass casualty event. Excavations at Yinzhou, the final Shang capital, have unearthed sprawling royal tombs that reveal the dynasty's chilling penchant for human sacrifice, a practice known as ren shun. When a king died, his entire retinue was often killed and buried with him. The tomb of Lady Fuha, a powerful consort and general, contained the remains of 16 human sacrifices alongside her coffin. Larger royal tombs contained hundreds. These weren't just burials, they were gruesome spectacles. Oracle bone inscriptions record sacrifices involving hundreds of captives at a time, many of whom were beheaded. One excavation revealed 22 severed skulls lining a single tomb passage. In total, archaeologists estimate over 13,000 people were sacrificed at Yinzhou alone. The belief system was straightforward. The king needed his court to serve him in the afterlife just as they had in life. This was also a brutal display of power, proving the king's authority extended beyond the grave. It was a tool of social control, reinforcing a rigid hierarchy where the lives of commoners were utterly disposable. Yet it leads to a dark thought about society. We think of our world as built on laws and institutions, but the Shang reveal a more fundamental truth. All power, in its most naked form, is the power over who lives and who dies. Number 7. The ancient Celts or Gauls. You are a guest in the home of a powerful Celtic warrior. He is showing you his most prized possession. It is not a finely crafted sword or a golden torque. It is a wooden chest. He opens it, and the smell of cedar oil fills the air. Inside, resting on a cloth, is a human head. It is perfectly preserved, the face of a long-dead enemy staring back at you. The warrior tells you with great pride that his ancestors refused a fortune in gold for this specific trophy. For the ancient Celts, the head was everything. They believed it was the seat of the soul, the center of emotion, and a symbol of divinity. This obsession manifested in a practice that horrified their Greek and Roman contemporaries: headhunting. In battle, Celtic warriors would decapitate their most distinguished enemies and attach the heads to the necks of their horses,
Back home, they would nail these trophies to their houses. For the most important enemies, they developed a form of embalming. Classical writers like Diodorus Siculus described how the Celts would preserve heads in cedar oil, keeping them in chests to be displayed to strangers as a testament to their prowess. Archaeological finds have confirmed this, revealing skulls with cut marks from decapitation and traces of conifer resin used as a preservative. This wasn't just about battlefield savagery, it was a deeply spiritual act. By taking an enemy's head, a warrior believed he was capturing their soul, absorbing their power, and preventing their ghost from seeking revenge. It was both a trophy and a talisman. But this belief system creates a disturbing paradox. If the only way to truly defeat an enemy is to steal their soul, does victory make you a hero, or does it simply turn you into the keeper of 1,000 angry ghosts?
Number 6. The Chimu Kingdom. It was a ceremony on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The procession was not of warriors, but of children, accompanied by young llamas. They were led to a place prepared for them, a site made sacred by the wet, muddy earth. One by one, their chests were cut open, their hearts were removed. This wasn't an act of war or a punishment for a crime. It was a sacrifice, and it was the largest single event of its kind the world has ever seen. In 2011, at a site in Peru known as Huanchaquito Las Lamas, archaeologists uncovered the grim legacy of the Chimu Kingdom. Here, around the year 1450, this pre-Incan culture performed the largest known mass child sacrifice in history. The remains of more than 140 children, aged between 5 and 14, were found alongside 200 juvenile llamas. Skeletal analysis shows that both the children and the animals were systematically killed by a transverse cut across the sternum, likely to extract their heart. Many of the children's faces were smeared with a red pigment, indicating a highly ritualized event. The children were buried facing the sea, while the llamas faced the Andes. The entire site was covered by a thick layer of mud, suggesting the sacrifice may have been a desperate response to a catastrophic weather event, possibly related to El Niño. The scientific explanation is that this was a desperate, large-scale offering to the gods, an attempt to stop the devastating floods that were destroying their agricultural society. It was the ultimate sacrifice, offering up their most precious resource, their future, to appease the supernatural forces they believed controlled their world. It is a chilling reminder of how terrified people can be driven to unthinkable acts. But what God, anywhere in the universe, would answer such a prayer? Number 5. The Scythian nomads. Imagine a warrior on horseback, a blur of motion and violence on the vast Eurasian steppe. He closes in on his enemy, and with a swift blow, the man falls. The warrior dismounts. This is the first man he has killed today, and tradition demands a tribute. He cuts his throat and drinks his blood. Later, he will take his skull and fashion it into a drinking cup. He will take his scalp and use it as a napkin, or perhaps sew it into a magnificent cloak made of hundreds of such trophies. The Scythians were a nomadic people who dominated the steppes from the 9th to the 2nd century BCE, and their reputation for ferocity was legendary, thanks largely to the detailed, if horrified, accounts of the Greek historian Herodotus. According to him, Scythian warriors had a host of terrifying rituals. A warrior had to drink the blood of the first enemy he killed. They were renowned for collecting scalps, which they would attach to their horses' bridles as proof of their kills. The more scalps a man had, the greater his prestige. The most elaborate trophies were cloaks made from the stitched-together scalps of their foes. And for their most hated enemies, a special fate was reserved. Their skulls would be sawn off below the eyebrows, cleaned out, and lined with gold to be used as ceremonial drinking cups. To the Greeks, this was the pinnacle of barbarism. But for the Scythians, these acts were deeply embedded in their social and military structure. They were a way of recording kills, establishing rank, and terrifying their enemies.
In a harsh world without written records, a man's reputation was literally written on his body and his belongings, in the blood and bone of his enemies. It's a brutal logic, born of a brutal landscape, but it forces us to ask, when survival is the only morality, is there any room left for humanity? Number 4. The Carthaginian Empire. It is a sacred place, an open-air enclosure under the North African sky. But it's not a temple in the way we understand it. It is a graveyard, filled with thousands of small urns buried over centuries. Each urn contains the cremated hashes and bone fragments of a child. Stone markers, or stelae, are inscribed not with eulogies, but with vows and pleas for blessings to the gods. This was not a place of mourning. It was a place of transaction, and the currency were the lives of infants. The civilization of Carthage, Rome's great rival, stands accused of one of history's most horrific practices: systematic, large-scale child sacrifice. The primary evidence comes from both the horrified accounts of their Greek and Roman enemies and the chilling archaeology of a site known as the Tophet. Here, archaeologists have uncovered an estimated 20,000 urns containing the cremated remains of infants, mostly newborns just a few months old. Many of these urns also contain the remains of animals, suggesting lambs were sometimes used as substitutes, which implies that the children were not. Inscriptions on the stelae don't mention death, but instead make vows to the gods Baal Hammon and Tanit. The rate of burials seems to skyrocket during times of crisis, suggesting the city turned to its darkest ritual when it was most desperate. Modern skeptics and some historians argued the Tophet was simply a special cemetery for infants who died of natural causes, and that the stories of sacrifice were propaganda spread by Carthage's enemies. This theory, however, struggles to explain the votive inscriptions and the presence of animal remains. The debate rages on, but if the traditional interpretation is true, it presents a terrifying picture of a society that believed the path to divine favor was paved with the bones of its own children. Which is the more chilling thought? That Carthage's enemies lied, or that they were telling the terrible truth?
Number 3. The Spartan state. You are a newborn infant in one of the most powerful city-states in the ancient world. But your first test is not of strength or intellect. It is a pass-fail exam of your physical perfection. Elders of the state inspect your tiny body for any sign of weakness or deformity. If you are deemed unfit, you will not be raised. You will be taken to a nearby chasm, a place called the Apathete, and left to die from exposure. Your life has just begun, and it has already been judged forfeit. The entire Spartan society was an engine designed for one purpose: to create the perfect soldier. This process began at birth. According to the historian Plutarch, newborn males were examined by a council of elders. Those deemed weak or imperfect were exposed and left to die. If a boy survived this first call, his real ordeal began at age 7, when he was taken from his family and entered the agoge. This was a brutal, state-sponsored military training program that would last for over a decade. Boys were kept perpetually hungry, taught to steal food, and beaten if caught. They were forced to go barefoot, sleep on beds of reeds, and endure constant physical hardship and violent competition to weed out the weak and forge them into instruments of war. Sparta's logic was one of extreme pragmatism. They were a small ruling class living in constant fear of a massive slave or helot population. Their survival depended on creating a military force so disciplined and so feared that rebellion was unthinkable. The agoge was the furnace that forged this weapon. But in their obsession with creating the perfect warrior, they created a society that had to sacrifice everything we would call humanity. It makes you wonder, what is the point of creating the perfect guardians for a city that is no longer worth guarding? Number 2. The Neo-Assyrian Empire. The king wishes to commemorate his victory. He does not commission a triumphant arch or a celebratory poem. Instead,
He orders his scribes to record the following. I built a pillar against his city gate, and I flayed all the chief men who had revolted, and I covered the pillar with their skins. I cut off the limbs of the officers. Many captives from among them I burned with fire. From some I cut off their noses, their ears, and their fingers. Of many I put out the eyes. This isn't a threat. It is a press release. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, which dominated the Near East from roughly 911 to 609 BCE, were the undisputed masters of psychological warfare. They didn't just conquer their enemies, they systematically terrorized them into submission. Their preferred methods were legendarily cruel. Flaying their enemies alive was a common practice, with the skins often displayed on city walls as a warning. They recorded mass deportations, impalements, and the creation of gruesome monuments, such as pillars made from human heads. Crucially, this wasn't just battlefield rage. It was calculated state policy, meticulously recorded by royal scribes and, most terrifyingly, depicted in graphic detail on massive stone reliefs that lined the walls of their palaces. An ambassador visiting the king would be forced to walk through a gallery of carved images showcasing exactly what happened to those who defied Assyrian power. The Assyrians understood a fundamental truth about power. The fear of violence can be more effective than violence itself. Their empire was vast and diverse, and they couldn't afford to be putting down rebellions everywhere at once. Their policy of calculated frightfulness was a form of mass communication, a brutal but effective way of maintaining control over a restive population. It was cruelty as a tool of efficiency. This forces a deeply uncomfortable question about governance. Is a society ruled by laws truly more stable than one ruled by nightmares? Number 1. The Aztec Empire. The sun rises over the city of Tenochtitlan. From atop the Great Pyramid, the Templo Mayor, you can see the causeways teeming with people and the canoes gliding across the lake. But you are not here to admire the view. You are on your back, held down by 4 priests on a sacrificial stone. A 5th priest raises a knife of razor-sharp obsidian. He is not aiming for your throat. He is aiming for your chest, because the Son of God is thirsty, and he demands your still-beating heart. While many Mesoamerican cultures practiced human sacrifice, the Aztecs took it to an industrial scale. Their cosmology demanded it. They believed their sun god, Huitzilopochtli, was in a constant battle against darkness, and he required a steady diet of human hearts and blood to keep the sun moving across the sky. This belief fueled a perpetual state of ritual warfare, where the primary goal was not to kill enemies, but to capture them alive for the sacrificial altar. At the top of their pyramids, a priest would perform the heart extraction. The body was then often rolled down the temple steps where it could be dismembered. The heads of victims were displayed on massive skull racks, or tsampatli. Archaeologists at one rack in Tenochtitlan have found over 600 skulls. From the Aztec perspective, this wasn't murder. It was a vital, sacred duty to prevent the end of the world. The victims were messengers to the gods, and sacrifice was the highest honor one could pay them. It was the metaphysical engine that kept the universe running. But this divine imperative also served the state, justifying imperial expansion and terrorizing their enemies. This perfect fusion of religious belief and state violence created one of history's most terrifying societies. It leaves us with the ultimate question. What is more frightening? A civilization that kills for power, or one that kills for God? So, now you know the real story. If you're the kind of person who always needs to know the real story, then you're in the right place. Subscribe, and we'll see you for the next one.